What a man experiences when he realizes your self-respect is stronger than your need for him is never soft or comforting. It is the exact moment his ego starts to break down. In that instant, he doesn't only feel the loss of your affection, but also the collapse of the control he believed he had over you. This isn't meant to comfort you or create false confidence, but to reveal the psychological chain reaction that begins when he understands you are no longer available on demand. Carl Jung suggested that no true encounter with another person happens without facing the inner shadow, and that is exactly what is triggered here. Your self-respect pushes him into confronting parts of himself he has been avoiding for a long time. Because your energy no longer reaches toward him, it withdraws permission and access. When this change happens, neither of you remains the same.
You return fully to your own center, and the energy that once moved toward him stops extending outward. He experiences it like a sudden disconnection, as though access to your inner world has been quietly taken away. His first reaction is not fear, but a deep, unspoken discomfort he cannot clearly define. Your calmness begins to feel unfamiliar, and what he once saw as flexibility now feels like firm, unmovable limits. Your boundaries are no longer treated as emotional reactions, but as solid facts. This forces him to reevaluate everything, because he is no longer dealing with someone who adjusts to keep peace, but with a woman who no longer grants automatic emotional access. At this point, he still believes he is losing his position, not realizing the deeper internal shift that has already taken place within you. The transformation begins with a few internal decisions you make quietly. You stop placing yourself in environments where you feel reduced, unseen, or emotionally compressed. You no longer feel the need to explain or justify yourself to someone who has no real intention of understanding you. Instead, you begin choosing actions that protect your peace and reflect your self-worth, even if they create discomfort for him. This is not cruelty, it is clarity, and clarity unsettles those who benefited from your confusion. He starts paying closer attention to his words and timing because your responses are no longer predictable. This is where respect is born, not because you demanded it, but because your consistency made the old dynamic impossible to continue. Dignity is not emotional distance, it is stability. You are no longer chasing anything, you are simply living with intention. As this deepens, respect slowly begins to shift into something more uneasy, almost like a quiet fear. Not the fear of a child, but the awareness of an adult realizing he may not be enough for you as you are now. He wants closeness, but he is also afraid of being exposed in his limitations. This creates inconsistency, moments of warmth followed by withdrawal as he tries to test whether you will return to old patterns. He is essentially checking if your emotional availability has come back. But the more he sees that you are no longer reacting the same way, the more unsettled he becomes. He can no longer regulate himself through your reactions, which leaves him alone with parts of himself he usually avoids. It becomes a confrontation with his unfiltered self, and for many, that experience feels overwhelming. The fourth stage arrives when he realizes there is no return to what once was. The version of you who overextended, tolerated imbalance, and adjusted yourself is no longer there. This realization can bring a quiet sense of grief, not necessarily for you, but for the comfort he once took for granted in the dynamic. The responsibility he avoided is now unavoidable. If he stays, he cannot engage with you casually anymore. He is forced to approach you with awareness and respect. His actions begin to carry weight in his mind because he understands your presence is no longer guaranteed under old conditions. You are no longer just comfort or escape. You are now someone he must meet honestly or risk losing entirely. The fifth stage is when your self-respect becomes part of your identity, not just a reaction to what you experienced. You are no longer responding to emotional breakdowns or trying to prove your value. You are simply living from inner stability. Your yes has meaning, and your no stands without explanation. You no longer feel the need to justify yourself because you understand who you are. This naturally changes how people respond to you. Those who cannot match your steadiness begin to drift away quietly, not in dramatic exits, but in silence. What remains is not confusion, but a more intentional and selective life. You are no longer pulled into dynamics that disturb your peace or blur your identity. The final stage is a complete inner shift, where your entire sense of self moves from fear to grounded awareness. You no longer question whether you are enough for a relationship, but whether the relationship is right for you. Your body finally understands that love does not have to feel like struggle or emotional war. You no longer need to explain your boundaries because you live them naturally. A man does not forget a woman like this because she represents wholeness, not pursuit. The cycle of repeating the same emotional patterns breaks at its root. Your dignity is no longer a tool to influence anyone, but a quiet force that shapes who stays in your life. It filters out misalignment and allows real connection to enter. At this stage, how others see you matters far less than how you see yourself. Many women mistake dignity for emotional distance or hardness, but in reality it is something far steadier and more grounded. It is consistency in how you treat yourself and what you allow. You are no longer reacting emotionally to every shift in his behavior. You are simply present in your own life, fully anchored. You are not chasing attention or validation anymore. You are choosing where your energy goes instead of offering it freely out of habit. This shift removes the ease with which he once accessed your patience and emotional flexibility. When your heart no longer feels like it has to suffer in order to love, it cannot go back to old patterns. He begins to realize that your vulnerability is no longer available to be taken advantage of, and that realization leaves him with only two options: grow into accountability or step away entirely. The next phase unfolds as a quieter but deeper emotional disturbance within him. What looks like confidence from the outside often hides uncertainty about whether he is truly enough for the version of you he now encounters. He still desires closeness, but at the same time he becomes uncomfortable with the possibility of being seen clearly, flaws and all. This creates inconsistency in how he shows up, moments of warmth followed by distance, as if he is testing emotional access without directly asking for it. He is essentially trying to confirm whether you will return to old patterns of chasing and explaining. But when you remain steady and do not pursue clarity from him, that internal discomfort grows. He can no longer stabilize himself by depending on your reactions. Instead, he is left alone with his unfiltered self, without emotional buffers, and that confrontation can feel deeply unsettling. Then comes the realization that the previous dynamic cannot be restored. The version of you who overextended, adjusted, and carried emotional weight that was never yours to hold is no longer active. There may be a quiet emotional response within him, not necessarily centered on you, but on the ease he once benefited from. That convenience is gone. Your energy no longer absorbs imbalance or excuses behavior that drains you. If he remains in your life, it is no longer under outdated conditions. He is now faced with the need to act with awareness and responsibility because the dynamic has changed permanently. You are no longer functioning as an emotional refuge or a fallback space. You are a fully realized individual who requires respect in how you are treated, not assumed availability. As this continues, your self-respect stops being something you consciously enforce and starts becoming your natural way of living. You are no longer in reaction mode, responding to emotional disruption or trying to prove your worth through explanation. You are simply living from a place of inner clarity. Your decisions carry weight because they are no longer influenced by fear or uncertainty. When you say yes, it is intentional, and when you say no, it stands without negotiation. There is no longer a need to justify your boundaries because you are aligned with them internally. This quiet certainty changes everything about how you are experienced by others. People who cannot meet you at that level gradually remove themselves, not through conflict, but through quiet distance. In the final shift, your entire inner world reorganizes itself around self-respect rather than insecurity. You no longer evaluate yourself through the lens of whether you are enough for someone else, but whether the connection itself is healthy for you. Love is no longer something that feels like struggle, emotional chaos, or constant proving. It becomes something that exists alongside peace rather than against it. Your boundaries are no longer spoken as warnings, they are simply lived as truth. You embody them without effort or performance. At this stage, your identity is no longer shaped by fear of loss, but by awareness of your own value, and that changes how every relationship moving forward is formed and sustained. A man doesn't forget a woman who reaches this state because she feels whole within herself. She is no longer someone who abandoned her own needs just to be chosen or kept. Instead, she has broken the pattern of repeating the same emotional mistakes, the same cycles of self-betrayal. Her dignity is no longer something defensive or distant. It is something steady and illuminating. It shows others how she expects to be treated, not through demands but through presence. It naturally filters out those who are not aligned and draws in those who are capable of real emotional responsibility and sincerity. At this point, you are no longer just reacting to relationships. You are defining the space in which relationships exist around you. You become the boundary itself, the standard, and the one who understands her own worth without needing validation. There is a quiet return to yourself, as if you have finally come home internally. The deepest shift happens when you realize that dignity is not something you use in response to someone else anymore, but the foundation of how you live every part of your life. From here, what someone else thinks or assumes about you loses its weight, because your sense of self is no longer dependent on external perception. It is fully anchored within you. What you're really describing is not about winning someone's attention or provoking a reaction in them. It is about psychological detachment from dependency and the return of internal authority. When a person begins to value themselves consistently, without negotiating that value based on someone else's behavior, the entire emotional dynamic changes. You stop living in anticipation of approval or fear of withdrawal. Instead, your nervous system starts to settle into something more stable because your sense of worth is no longer outsourced. In unhealthy attachment patterns, people often confuse intensity with love. They tolerate inconsistency, overgive, or remain emotionally available even when their needs are unmet, hoping that effort will eventually create security. But what actually happens is a loss of self-clarity. You begin adapting yourself to maintain connection, and over time, that creates emotional exhaustion and quiet resentment. When that pattern is interrupted, it can feel like a shift in power, but in reality, it is just the restoration of balance. From a psychological standpoint, consistency is what builds emotional safety. When you become consistent in your boundaries, communication, and self-respect, you are no longer sending mixed signals to yourself or others. This is where attraction dynamics are often misunderstood. What changes is not that you are trying to control someone else's response, but that you are no longer abandoning yourself to maintain it. That shift is internally disruptive for people who benefited from your lack of boundaries, because they are now forced to relate to you as a full person rather than a flexible emotional space. There is also an important internal phase that people often overlook. At first, self-respect feels like effort. You have to consciously stop over-explaining, stop chasing clarity, and stop tolerating behavior that doesn't align with you. But over time, it stops feeling like effort and becomes identity. You don't act different anymore. You simply don't resonate with old patterns. That is where real change happens, because it is no longer about strategy or reaction, but about embodiment. What often follows is a quiet recalibration in your relationships. Some people will naturally step back because they were connected to your overextension, not your authentic self. Others may adjust and engage more responsibly because the dynamic no longer allows emotional ambiguity. But the most important shift is internal. You stop interpreting relationships as something you must earn through sacrifice and start seeing them as something that should be mutual without self-erasure. At the deepest level, this is what coming home to yourself actually means. It is the moment you no longer measure your value through how much you are chosen, tolerated, or pursued. Instead, you evaluate experiences based on whether they align with your peace, your stability, and your self-respect. When that becomes your baseline, your emotional world becomes far less chaotic, not because life becomes perfect, but because you are no longer abandoning yourself inside it.